Picture this. It is January 17th, 1781. The ground is cold, the Carolina backcountry is eerily quiet, and a ragtag collection of American fighters is standing in an open field waiting for the most feared cavalry commander in the entire British Army to come charging straight at them. No cover, no fortifications, no walls to hide behind, just grass, trees in the distance, and the sound of approaching hooves and drums. Any rational military commander looking at this situation would call it suicide. The Americans were outnumbered. Many of their fighters were untrained militia who had a notorious reputation for running away the moment musket fire got thick. The British commander riding toward them, Banastre Tarleton, knew all of this. He had seen American militia break and flee before. He had built his entire career on exploiting that exact weakness. He was confident, he was aggressive, and he was about to walk directly into one of the most perfectly engineered military traps in the history of warfare. What happened at the Battle of Cowpens on that freezing January morning was not an accident. It was not lucky. It was not the result of the British making some catastrophic blunder out of nowhere. It was the product of one man's extraordinary ability to look at his own army's greatest weakness and turn it into his most devastating weapon. That man was Daniel Morgan, and what he did at Cowpens should be studied by anyone who wants to understand how genuine tactical genius actually works. Not genius as in having better equipment or more soldiers. Genius as in understanding human nature so deeply, so completely, that you can predict exactly what your enemy will do and build a trap so elegant that the harder your enemy fights, the more completely they destroy themselves. We are going to break down exactly how Morgan did it. We are going to walk through the trap layer by layer, explain why it worked psychologically as much as militarily, and explore why it became the nightmare that British commanders across the entire American Revolutionary War could never quite solve. Let us start with the problem that Daniel Morgan inherited when he was given command of the American forces in the Southern Theater. By late 1780, the American cause in the South was in genuine crisis. The British under Lord Cornwallis had essentially dominated the Carolinas. They had crushed American forces at Camden just months earlier, a battle where American militia had done exactly what everyone expected them to do. They panicked, they broke, they fled, and they left the Continental regulars surrounded and slaughtered. That defeat was humiliating. It reinforced every British assumption about American fighting capability, which was basically that the militia were useless in a direct confrontation. Morgan understood this reputation deeply. He knew exactly what the British thought of his militia fighters, and critically, he also understood why the British assessment was not entirely wrong. Militia soldiers were not cowards. They were farmers, tradespeople, ordinary men with families and livelihoods. They had agreed to fight, but they had not signed up for the brutal, grinding, close-quarters combat that professional European soldiers trained for their entire careers. Asking militia to stand in a line and absorb repeated volleys of musket fire while maintaining discipline and composure was asking them to do something that ran completely contrary to every survival instinct they had. They were going to flinch. Some of them were going to run. This was not a character flaw. This was human nature. Every previous American commander had tried to solve this problem by attempting to make the militia behave more like professional soldiers. They drilled them harder. They threatened punishments for desertion. They tried to impose discipline that would override that survival instinct. And it never quite worked well enough, because you cannot drill away thousands of years of biological programming in a few weeks. Morgan did something completely different. He stopped trying to fight the militia's nature and started designing his entire battle plan around it. Here is the genius at the core of Cowpens. Morgan did not need his militia to be brave. He did not need them to stand their ground under heavy fire. He did not need them to be soldiers in the traditional European sense at all. He just needed them to do two specific things, and then do the one thing they were already naturally inclined to do anyway. Morgan arranged his forces in 3 lines. This is important to visualize because the geometry of this formation is where the trap lives. The first line, the furthest forward, was composed of skirmishers. These were experienced riflemen, and their job was simple: harass the advancing British, pick off officers, then fall back to the second line. Not a retreat, a deliberate withdrawal to a new position. The second line was where the militia stood, and this is the line that everything depended on. Morgan walked among these men the night before the battle. He talked to them personally. He did not give them a thundering speech about glory and sacrifice. He gave them something far more valuable. He gave them a realistic and achievable mission. He told them he did not need them to fight like the Continental regulars. He told them he just needed 2 volleys, fire twice, aim for the officers and the sergeants, the men with the fancy decorations and the swords, and then they could fall back. He was not just giving them permission to retreat, he was making the retreat part of the plan. This is psychologically remarkable. Think about what this did to those militia soldiers. For the first time, they were not being asked to suppress their fear and stay put against their instincts. They were being asked to fire twice with precision and then do the thing that felt natural. The pressure was off. The mission was achievable. And crucially, they knew exactly where to go when they fell back, because Morgan had placed his third line, the Continental regulars, behind a gentle hill at the rear of the field. The militia was not retreating into chaos. They were retreating through a gap in the Continental line, reorganizing on the flanks and preparing to re-enter the fight. The third line was where Morgan kept his professional soldiers, the Continental regulars. These men had the training and the discipline to stand and trade volleys at close range. They were the anvil, the militia was the bait. Now let us talk about what was happening on the British side, because the trap only works if the prey behaves predictably, and Tarleton was extraordinarily predictable. Banastre Tarleton was 26 years old, dashingly confident, and genuinely talented at a specific kind of warfare. He was a cavalry commander who had built his reputation on speed, aggression, and the psychological destruction of his opponents. His method was brutally simple: move fast, hit hard, overwhelm before the enemy can organize, and if they run, chase them down and finish them. He had done this repeatedly, and it had worked repeatedly. At the Waxhaws earlier in the war, his dragoons had pursued fleeing Americans and cut them down even as they tried to surrender, an incident that became notorious throughout the colonies and earned him the nickname Bloody Tarleton. This was the man riding toward Morgan's position that morning. And the thing about Tarleton's entire tactical philosophy is that it was built on a specific assumption: the assumption that American forces, and particularly American militia, would break when pressed. His entire system was designed to exploit that moment of breaking, to accelerate it and turn it into a rout. Morgan understood this. He understood Tarleton's psychology as well as he understood his own men's psychology. And so the trap was not just physical. It was not just about the placement of soldiers in a field. It was a psychological trap designed around Tarleton's own aggression and his own certainty. When the battle began and the British line advanced, the first line of American skirmishers did their work and then pulled back, just as planned. The British pressed forward. Then the militia opened fire. And here is where Morgan's pre-battle instructions paid off magnificently. The militia had been told to aim for the officers. They did. The British advance started taking significant casualties among its leadership from the very first moments. Then the militia fired their second volley, turned, and ran. From Tarleton's perspective, this looked exactly like every other time he had seen American militia break. The enemy's forward line was retreating. The enemy soldiers were running, the drill was working, his blood was up, his men were advancing with momentum. Everything his instincts and his experience told him said this was the moment to press the attack hard, because a running enemy is a beaten enemy, and a beaten enemy needs to be finished before they can regroup. He pushed forward aggressively, his lines surged ahead, and they ran straight into the Continental regulars who had been waiting patiently behind that gentle rise. The regulars had not been shaken. They had not seen any of the chaos from the front. They were fresh, they were organized, and they absorbed the British charge and began trading volleys at close range. The British momentum that Tarleton had been counting on ran directly into a wall of disciplined fire. But the trap was not complete yet.
Because while the British were now tangled up with the Continentals at the front, something was happening on their flanks that would turn a defeat into an annihilation. The militia that had appeared to flee was not fleeing at all. They had run through the gaps in the Continental line exactly as planned, reformed on the far side of the hill, caught their breath, and were now swinging around to hit the British on both sides. At the same time, American cavalry under William Washington, a distant relative of George Washington, had been positioned on the flanks as well, and now came driving in. The British found themselves simultaneously fighting a disciplined front line they could not break through, being hit on their left flank and being struck on their right. The retreat that had looked like American defeat was actually the jaws of a trap closing. Tarleton's men broke. The very panic he had spent his career inflicting on others now swept through his own ranks. His cavalry, the elite force he always relied on as his decisive weapon, either fled the field or was captured. Tarleton himself escaped, but he rode away having lost effectively his entire command. In roughly 50 minutes of fighting, the British Legion had been destroyed. Of approximately 1,100 British soldiers who entered the battle, around 800 were killed, wounded, or captured. American casualties were roughly 72 total. The ratio of casualties was so lopsided that it is almost difficult to believe the two forces were fighting in an open field without the Americans having any structural fortification advantage. Now, let us go deeper into why this worked, because the surface explanation, Morgan tricked Tarleton, does not capture what actually happened here. The first layer is what we might call expectation engineering. Morgan did not try to create a situation that his enemy could not understand. He created a situation that looked completely familiar to his enemy. Every element of the opening phase of Cowpens confirmed every assumption Tarleton had about American militia. The skirmishers pulled back. The militia fired a couple of volleys and ran. This was exactly the script that British commanders had seen play out multiple times. When the familiar pattern appeared, Tarleton did not question it. He followed his training, his instinct, and his previous experience. He accelerated into what looked like a collapsing enemy. Morgan weaponized Tarleton's certainty. The more confident you are that you understand what is happening, the less you scrutinize what is actually happening. Tarleton was so certain he was watching a militia rout that he could not process the alternative explanation, that the running was intentional, that it was an invitation rather than a collapse. The second layer is what we could call appropriate task assignment. Morgan's genius was in understanding that different units had different capabilities and designing the battle so that each unit was only ever asked to do what it was actually capable of doing. The skirmishers were asked to harass and withdraw. They could do that. The militia was asked to fire 2 volleys at specific targets and then fall back to a prearranged location. They could do that. The Continentals were asked to hold a line against a frontal assault. They were trained for that. The cavalry was asked to exploit disorder on the flanks. That was exactly their specialty. There was no unit in Morgan's force that was asked to operate beyond its training or natural inclination. Every piece of the puzzle fit. This sounds simple, but it represents a profound departure from how most commanders thought. Most commanders had an ideal vision of how a battle should look and tried to shape their forces to fit that ideal. Morgan reversed the process. He looked at the forces he actually had and designed the battle to fit them. The third layer is perhaps the most philosophically interesting. Morgan solved the militia problem not by fixing the militia, but by reframing what the militia was for. In every previous engagement where American militia had broken and run, that breaking had been catastrophic because it was unplanned and uncontrolled. The militia was supposed to be part of the defensive line, and when they ran, they left a gap that the British could pour through. The running was the problem, because it was structurally catastrophic. At Cowpens, the running was not a gap, it was a gate. The militia ran through a specific opening in the Continental line, reformed at a predetermined location,
and became available for the flanking attack. The retreat did not weaken Morgan's position, it strengthened it. The same behavior that had been catastrophic in every other context became tactically decisive in this one, simply because Morgan had planned for it and built the rest of the battle around it. This is a lesson that extends far beyond military history. The behavior you think is your problem is often actually your asset. It just depends on the context you create around it. There is another element of what Morgan did that deserves attention, and that is the psychological management of his own soldiers in the hours before the battle. Morgan was famous for his personal connection to his troops. He was not an aristocrat or a formally educated officer. He was a Virginian frontiersman who had come up through hard circumstances and understood the men he commanded because he had lived a version of their lives. The night before Cowpens, he was reportedly everywhere in the camp, talking to men around their fires, joking with them, walking through the militia position, explaining the plan in plain, direct language. He did something specific with the militia that reveals a deep understanding of anxiety and performance. He framed their role not as a test of courage, but as a technical task. He told them to fire twice and aim for the men with the epaulets, the officers and sergeants. He gave them a concrete, achievable action to focus on instead of the vague, overwhelming pressure of "be brave" and "do not run." When people are frightened, giving them a specific task to focus on channels their energy and reduces the paralysis that comes from pure fear. Morgan instinctively understood this. He also, and this is crucial, promised them they would be able to fall back. He did not promise them they would not face danger. He did not tell them it would be easy. He told them the truth, that he needed 2 volleys, and then they could retreat to safety. By being honest about the plan and honest about what was expected, he got genuine buy-in. These militia soldiers were not suppressing their fear, they were channeling it. They had a job to do, they knew what it was, they had a clear exit, and they executed it with remarkable precision under real fire. The result was a complete transformation of what militia soldiers were capable of achieving in a pitched battle, not because they had suddenly become trained professionals, but because a brilliant commander had given them a task that matched their actual capabilities and a battle plan that made their most natural behavior into an asset. Now let us zoom out and think about what Cowpens meant in the larger context of the Revolutionary War, and specifically what it meant for British military commanders across the entire theatre. The British had a serious problem with the American way of war that Cowpens crystallized in the most painful possible way. British military doctrine was built around professional armies fighting in relatively predictable patterns on defined battlefields. The system worked magnificently when both sides were playing by the same rules. The challenge posed by the American conflict was that the Americans frequently were not playing by the same rules, not because they were sneaky, but because they genuinely could not field an army capable of fighting conventionally for long periods. Their army was a hybrid, a mix of trained regulars and citizen soldiers, always underfunded, always short of equipment, constantly dealing with enlistment expirations. What Morgan demonstrated at Cowpens was that this hybrid character, which the British saw as a weakness, could be leveraged as a tactical asset by a commander who understood it. The irregularity that British commanders had learned to exploit became a trap. The brittleness of the militia became a lure. The fact that British commanders expected American forces to behave a certain way meant that when an American commander deliberately arranged for them to behave exactly that expected way, in a controlled, intentional manner, the British had no framework for recognizing it as something other than what they always saw. After Cowpens, Cornwallis was furious. He pursued Morgan aggressively in what became known as the Race to the Dan, trying to trap and destroy the American Southern Army before it could escape across the Dan River into Virginia. He pushed his men so hard that he stripped his own army of supplies and mobility in the pursuit. He burned his own baggage train to increase his speed, and he never quite caught Morgan. The psychological impact of Cowpens, the loss of Tarleton's legion, The recognition that the assumptions he had been operating on were vulnerable drove Cornwallis into a kind of strategic recklessness that ultimately contributed to the chain of events leading to Yorktown and the effective end of the war. A single 50-minute battle in the South Carolina backcountry had consequences that reverberated all the way to the surrender at Yorktown 9 months later. That is how decisive tactical genius can be when it operates at the right moment in the right context. Let us also acknowledge the human element of this story that sometimes gets lost in the tactical analysis. Daniel Morgan was suffering from severe sciatica throughout the Cowpens campaign. He was in genuine pain, barely able to ride, sleeping on the ground in the January cold. The intellectual and physical effort required to design and execute this battle under those personal conditions is extraordinary.
He was not operating from a comfortable headquarters with aids and maps and the luxury of long planning periods.
He was a sick man in the field, doing everything himself, relying on his understanding of people and terrain to compensate for every material disadvantage his army faced. This is worth noting because it speaks to something important about what military genius actually looks like. It is not clean. It is not comfortable. It is not the stuff of heroic paintings where handsome generals stand on hills surveying perfect formations. It is a man in pain, walking through a cold camp the night before a battle, talking to frightened farmers, telling them they just need to fire twice and then they can run, and somehow knowing that this completely unconventional approach is going to work. The Battle of Cowpens also raises fascinating questions about what we mean when we talk about military discipline. The conventional view is that military discipline means doing what you are told, even when you are frightened, maintaining your position even when your instincts scream at you to run, being so thoroughly trained that professional behavior overrides biological fear response. This is a genuine and valuable form of discipline, and the Continental regulars at Cowpens demonstrated exactly that kind of discipline in holding their line against Tarleton's assault. But Morgan demonstrated a completely different kind of discipline that is in some ways more sophisticated. Call it designed discipline. Instead of trying to impose a behavior pattern on people through training and coercion, he designed a situation where the most natural human response to fear produced the most tactically effective outcome. The militia soldiers did not need to suppress their fear. They needed to channel it. The retreat that looked like collapse was actually one of the most disciplined tactical withdrawals of the entire war. Not because the men were fighting their instincts, but because their instincts were taking them exactly where Morgan needed them to go. There is a profound lesson in this about the relationship between human nature and design. Most institutional responses to human weakness try to overcome that weakness through enforcement and training. The more elegant solution is to design systems where human weakness becomes functional, where the natural response is the desired response. Morgan did not fix his militia, he fixed the battle. So why does this story matter beyond its historical context? Why should anyone who is not a military historian or a Revolutionary War enthusiast care about what happened in a South Carolina field in 1781? Because the principles Morgan applied at Cowpens are not military principles. They are human principles. They apply anywhere that someone is trying to lead people who are imperfect, who have limitations, who are going to flinch under pressure, who are going to follow their instincts in moments of stress. The first principle is this: your people's limitations are not problems to eliminate, they are design constraints to work with. Morgan did not have a perfect army. He had the army in front of him. Instead of wishing it were different, he built a plan around its actual characteristics. Every leader eventually faces the gap between the team they wish they had and the team they actually have. The Morgan approach is to accept that gap, understand it completely, and then design around it, rather than against it. The second principle is that expectation is a weapon. Tarleton was beaten as much by his own certainty as by Morgan's tactics. His confidence in his ability to read the battle, to recognize a militia rout, to know what running soldiers meant, made him blind to the trap. In any competitive environment, your opponent's assumptions about you are an asset, if you understand them clearly enough to manipulate them deliberately. Looking weaker than you are is only useful if you have a plan for what happens when the stronger party overcommits. The third principle is that achievable tasks produce extraordinary results. Morgan got remarkable performance from ordinary people, not by demanding extraordinary things, but by giving them extremely clear, genuinely achievable tasks and trusting them to execute those specific things well. 2 volleys and then run. That is it. Do not ask people to be superhuman. Give them something concrete and real and true, and watch what happens when they actually can do the thing they are being asked to do. The Battle of Cowpens stands as possibly the most complete tactical victory in American military history. The margin of success, the elegance of the trap, the way every element of the plan fit together into a single coherent mechanism is almost unprecedented. Military historians still study it. West Point still teaches it. And the reason is not just that Morgan won. Plenty of battles produce victories. The reason Cowpens is still studied and taught and discussed is that it reveals something timeless and true about the nature of genius. Genius is not about being smarter or stronger or better equipped than the person across from you. Genius is about understanding the situation more completely. It is about seeing what is actually there, including what is inconvenient and imperfect and flawed, and finding the approach where those inconvenient realities become the mechanism of success rather than the obstacles to it. Morgan did not win in spite of his militia's limitations. He won because of them. That is what makes Cowpens not just a military victory, but a masterclass in human understanding. Daniel Morgan retired shortly after Cowpens, his body simply unable to continue in the field. He was honored and celebrated, but largely faded from the popular memory of the revolution in the way that so many crucial figures do when they do not occupy the center of the famous paintings or the dramatic political narratives. George Washington stands at the center of American revolutionary memory. Nathanael Greene, who commanded the overall Southern strategy that Cowpens was part of, gets some recognition. Morgan himself is often a footnote. But the 50 minutes he orchestrated in that South Carolina field changed the trajectory of the entire war. Tarleton never recovered his reputation. Cornwallis never recovered his strategic position in the South. The relentless pursuit that followed Cowpens exhausted his army. At Guilford Court House 2 months later, a battle Morgan had no role in, Cornwallis technically won, but suffered casualties so severe that it was famously described by one observer as another such victory would ruin the British Army. By October of 1781, Cornwallis was trapped at Yorktown, and the war was effectively over. All of this traces back, in meaningful ways, to one man's decision to stop fighting his army's nature and start using it. To look at frightened militia soldiers and see not a liability, but a lure. To understand his enemy so completely that he could engineer a situation where that enemy's greatest strength, his aggression, his certainty, his momentum, became the very thing that destroyed him. The genius trap that every British commander feared was not a technology or a formation or a particular weapon. It was the possibility that the Americans might have commanders who understood people. Commanders who saw human nature clearly enough to design around it rather than against it. At Cowpens, they had exactly that, and the result was one of the most complete, elegant, and strategically consequential victories in the history of the Western world. If you want to understand military genius, if you want to understand leadership, if you want to understand how the most elegant solutions to difficult problems actually get found, the Battle of Cowpens is the place to start. Not because it was the biggest battle, or the most famous, or the one with the most dramatic stakes, but because it is the one where you can see every gear of the mechanism most clearly, where the trap is laid bare, where you can trace the exact line between Daniel Morgan's understanding of human nature and the destruction of Tarleton's legion in a cold Carolina field on a January morning 245 years ago. That is what makes it worth understanding today, not as history, as a lesson in how the world actually works and how the best minds navigate it.